I had been back in New York for less than an hour when I realized my marriage was not the only thing waiting to break. My flight from Frankfurt landed just after noon. By the time I made it through JFK and into the back of the town car, my phone was full of the usual things that pile up when you've been overseas too long: board updates, procurement summaries, a note from legal, 3 missed calls from my assistant, and one cheerful text from my husband asking how soon I'd be home. I didn't answer. That wasn't unusual. When I traveled, I had a habit of going quiet for the last stretch home, using the silence to rearrange myself before stepping back into my life. A month in Germany had left me exhausted in a very specific way, not just physically. It was the kind of fatigue that comes from being the person who handles the hard part while someone else gets photographed, accepting the praise. The trip had been necessary. Apex had been negotiating a major equipment acquisition for months, and the final meetings had required somebody who could sit in a room for 6 hours, catch every buried condition in the contract, and push back without losing the relationship. Officially, that kind of thing belonged to the CEO. Officially, the CEO was my husband. In practice, the work had always landed with me. By the time the car came off the bridge and turned south toward Manhattan, I had already decided I wasn't going home first. I wanted to stop by the hospital. I told myself it was about efficiency. I had numbers to review, a procurement timeline to confirm, and a board packet to clean up before the next meeting. The truth was simpler than that. I wanted to see the place before anyone knew I was back. Apex University Hospital sat on some of the most expensive real estate in the city. All glass and steel, quiet confidence. My father had built it. One department, one donor, one impossible expansion at a time. Even now, years after his death, the building still carried his taste for order. Clean lines. No wasted motion. No pretending to be grander than the work inside it. As the car pulled up, the driver started toward the private executive entrance. Main lobby, I said. He turned in his seat. Mom, the front is fine. If I used the executive entrance, someone would alert the 5th floor. Before I even stepped off the elevator, smiles would appear. Jackets would straighten. And whatever version of the hospital people wanted me to see would be ready by the time I got there. I didn't want the prepared version. I wanted the truth. Inside, the lobby looked exactly the way a major hospital lobby should look at midday. Crowded, but controlled. Boussu. Without panic. Families clustered near the reception desk. A volunteer in a blue vest was helping an older couple with the kiosk. The smell of coffee drifted in from the cafe near the elevators, mixing with antiseptic, floor polish, and the cool air conditioning that always felt a little too strong. For a few seconds, I relaxed. Then I noticed 3 things in quick succession. First, a patient, transport cher, had been left, half blocking a corridor near the imaging wing. Small thing. Sloppy. But still small. Second, one of the reception staff, someone I recognized, though I couldn't immediately place her name, was trying very hard not to look toward the entrance. Third, raised above everything else, I heard a young woman's voice say, if somebody had done their job the first time, I wouldn't still be standing here. There is a particular kind of voice that tells you, before you even turn your head, that the problem isn't the moment. It's the pattern behind it. I followed the sound. Near the valet station, A young woman in heels and a fitted cream dress was leaning over the counter, speaking to Henry Walsh like he was something she had found. On the bottom of her shoe, Henry had worked for my father for almost 3 decades. He was technically no longer old enough to be doing any job that involved long hours on his feet. But every time HR suggested retirement, he refused. He said the lobby kept him young. My father used to joke that Henry knew the emotional weather of the hospital better than any executive ever would. Now Henry stood, with both hands folded, in front of him, shoulders slightly rounded, taking abuse from a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. I said I left the keys with you for a reason, she snapped. Do you have any idea what happens to leather when a car sits in direct sun for an hour? Henry tried to answer. Miss, I'm very sorry. There was an emergency at the curb and I don't need the story. I need competence. A few feet away, an AMT crew was easing a pale, middle-aged man onto a gurney, while one of our physicians walked alongside them, talking the man through his breathing. I recognized him instantly. David Chen. He had one hand on the rail, and one hand lifted in a calm, grounding gesture I had watched him use on frightened patients since we were both 23 years old. That was what bothered me most. In one corner of the lobby, a real emergency was being handled with quiet professionalism. In the other, a woman who appeared to work here was performing entitlement at full volume. And nobody looked surprised by it. Not offended. Not shocked. Accustomed. The young woman finally stepped back from the counter and checked her reflection. In her phone camera, she smoothed her hair, adjusted a gold bracelet at her wrist, and sighed dramatically, as if Henry had inconvenienced her by existing. A hospital badge swung from a lanyard, clipped to her bag. I caught the first name before it flipped over. Tiffany. Intern. I looked down at my watch. It was after 9. Dress code aside. She wasn't carrying a clipboard, a laptop, or anything remotely connected to work. She looked like she was heading to brunch in Soho, not into a hospital where people came to hear whether their mother I had made it through surgery. I walked over before I had fully decided to. Henry, I said gently, why don't you take 5 minutes? He looked up at me, startled, and then his face changed. Recognition flashed there, almost instantly. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. He swallowed whatever he had almost said and stepped back. The intern turned to me with immediate irritation. I was still in the suit I'd worn on the flight. Cream silk blouse, tailored slacks, low heels. Nothing flashy. My hair was pulled back, my makeup mostly gone. To her, I probably looked like exactly what she would dismiss on sight, a tired woman in her 30s, with opinions she had no interest in hearing. Can I help you? She asked, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. You can start by lowering your voice, I said, and you can stop speaking to him like that. Her eyebrows went up, around us. The lobby didn't stop moving, but I felt the attention shift. A few glances, a pause at the desk. That subtle awareness people have when they sense a scene might be forming. Tiffany tucked a strand of hair behind one ear and gave me a once-over. This is an employee issue. No, I said. This is a professionalism issue. She smiled without warmth. Are you with a patient? I'm with the hospital. That should have made her step more carefully. Instead, something amused crossed her face, as if she had heard that line before. from people who thought the rules still applied. Then you should know, she said, that some of us don't have to follow the same stupid little rules as everybody else. I held her gaze. Interesting policy. Who told you that? She folded her arms. The only person here whose opinion actually matters. I didn't answer. You know what? I really don't have time for this. She shifted her bag higher on her shoulder and stepped closer, dropping her voice just enough to turn the moment from public rudeness into private cruelty. So why don't you go sit down somewhere? Calm yourself and stop trying to manage things that are way above your level. Something in Henry's face tightened. A receptionist stared very hard at her computer. Across the lobby, David glanced over, taking in the geometry of the moment, the way good doctors read a room before they move into it. The smart move would have been to say nothing else. Go upstairs. Call HR. Call legal. Call my husband. Handle it with the sterile efficiency of a memo. But there are moments when walking away becomes its own kind of lie. I said, "What's your last name?" She laughed softly. Why? You planning to report me? Yes. That made her blink. Then she recovered. Go ahead. She pulled out her phone again. Not to check it this time, but to hold it loosely at her side, like a prop. That made her bolder. Actually? Report me to him directly? That'll save us both some time. I already knew, before she said the name, that I was going to hate hearing it. She smiled and delivered it with the easy confidence of someone who had used it often and been rewarded every time. Mark. Just my husband's first name. Nothing else. No title. No formality. No hesitation. And somehow, that landed harder than if she had said CEO. For one strange second, the lobby seemed to tilt. Not because I was shocked. He might be cheating. Women in my position do not have the luxury of being shocked by every obvious thing. What hit me was something more precise than that. Familiarity. Routine. The casualness of a person who had been made comfortable inside a system that belonged to me. Inside a building built by my father. Using my husband's name like an access badge. I looked at her a little more carefully then. The jewelry. The confidence. The way staff were avoiding eye contact instead of correcting her. The way she was testing me without any fear of consequence. This wasn't a flirtation. This was an ecosystem. And all at once, I understood that whatever had happened during my month away had not started during my month away. Tiffany tilted her head. You look confused. I almost laughed. Confused wasn't the word. The word was clear. Clear in the way things become clear, right before they get ugly. I glanced once toward the elevators. Somewhere upstairs. My husband was probably in a conference room, speaking in that polished tadier, measured voice he used when he wanted donors, regulators, or board members to forget how little substance sat underneath the packaging. Back in the lobby, Tiffany was still watching me, waiting for me to react. Like every other person she had pushed around here, I didn't give her that. Instead, I smiled very slightly and said, All right. She frowned. All right, what? All right. I repeated. Let's not waste any more time. Then I took out my phone. And for the first time since landing in New York, I called my husband. Mark answered on the fourth ring. He sounded distracted, mildly annoyed, and entirely unaware that his life had already started to come apart. Hey, he said. You land? I didn't take my eyes off Tiffany. I did. You should have texted me. I'm in the middle of something upstairs. I know, I said. Stay there. I'll come to you in a minute. That caught him off guard. You're here? In the building? A beat of silence. Then his voice changed. Not much. But enough. He was recalculating. Running through possibilities. Who had seen me? Whether anyone knew, I'd come in through the lobby. Whether whatever he had been doing, all month, had just lost the protection of distance. You came straight from the airport? He asked. Yes. Okay. He let out a short breath, aiming for warmth, and landing somewhere near performance. Come up. I'll clear 5 minutes. 5 minutes. After 4 weeks overseas, handling the work he should have been doing. That was what he was offering me. I said, I'll be there soon, and ended the call. Tiffany was watching my face, trying to read whether that conversation had gone in her favor. When she found nothing there, she rolled one shoulder and gave me a look that said she'd already won anyway. See? She said quietly. Told you. I slid the phone back into my bag. Did you? She looked pleased with herself again. Which was useful. Arrogant people often rush to fill silence, especially when they think they're establishing dominance. Henry had moved a few steps away, but I could still feel his concern. The receptionist, who had been avoiding the scene, was now staring at her screen, with the tense stillness of someone pretending not to listen, and hearing every word. Across the lobby, David had turned back to his patient, but not fully. He was tracking the room, in his peripheral vision, the way good physicians do, when they know instability hasn't passed, it has only moved. Tiffany said, You know, this would all go a lot better for you if you learned how things work here. The sentence hit harder than it should have. Not because of her, because of the phrase, how things work here. One tolerated exception becomes a pattern. One favored person becomes a signal. One set of rules quietly stops applying. And before long, the people who still believe in standards are the ones made to feel naive. I had seen that happen. In companies before, in foundations, on boards, even in marriages. Just not in my father's hospital, I think. I said, I have a better idea than you do. She laughed. Right. I gave Henry a final nod and stepped away. I did not need another minute in that lobby to know something was wrong. I had enough already. The behavior, the staff reaction, the casual use of Mark's first name, the confidence of someone who had been protected before. What I didn't have yet was scale. Affair was one possibility. Entitlement was another. But neither alone, explained the atmosphere. The atmosphere said something larger had been allowed to settle in. I crossed the lobby, toward the elevators, aware that Tiffany was still standing there, likely assuming she had just sent some inconvenient woman upstairs to be corrected by the real power in the building. What she didn't know was that I had spent most of the past 10 years cleaning up after the real power in the building. That wasn't how I would have described my marriage a few years ago. When I met Mark, he had the kind of presence people confuse with competence all the time. He was attractive, without being vain about it. Socially fluid, quick with names, quick with stories, and gifted in the specific art of making other people feel chosen. In fundraising rooms, that mattered. With donors, media, local officials, and the kind of board members who liked being flattered more than informed. He was effective in a way that made certain problems disappear before they fully formed. My father had liked him at first. Not because he trusted him. My father trusted almost no one. Quickly, he liked Mark because he understood The use of him. Every institution needs a face, he told me once, years before he got sick. The trick is not confusing the face with the spine. At the time, I laughed. I was still young enough to think love made you immune to structural mistakes. By the time my father died, I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. By then, Mark and I were already married. And grief did what grief often does. It accelerated arrangements that should have been examined more slowly. There was a board to steady, lenders to reassure, expansion plans to preserve. My father was gone. I was 30. And every older man in a suit who had ever smiled at me across a conference table suddenly wanted to know whether I would be comfortable letting more experienced people guide the hospital forward. Mark knew how to stand in that room and make them feel calm. I knew how to keep the place alive. So we built an arrangement around those two truths. On paper, it made sense. He took the visible role. I took strategy, restructuring, vendor negotiations, long-range planning, the difficult internal decisions, and anything requiring close reading, institutional memory, or sustained pressure. Publicly, he became the polished executive. Privately, I became the person who made his polish possible. For a while, I told myself that was partnership. Some women inherit family businesses and spend years fighting to be taken seriously. I had chosen, or thought I had chosen, a different route. Let him carry the public title. Let him absorb the ego management. Let me protect the substance. It was not entirely a lie. There had been good years. Real loans. 2 children. Late dinners eaten over spreadsheets. Nights when we'd sit in the library, after everyone else had gone to bed, and talk through the hospital's future, like we were building something together, instead of merely preserving what had been left to us. Mark could be attentive when he wanted to be. He knew how to study a person's weaknesses and respond with exactly the right tenderness. That skill works in marriage too. The elevator doors opened on 5. As I stepped out, I passed a pair of associates from legal who greeted me with visible surprise. One nearly dropped his folder. The other recovered fast enough to say, "Welcome back, Ms. Hayes." Not chairwoman. Not in the hallway. Smart. "Thank you," I said. Their faces told me something before their words did. Nobody had known I was coming in through the front. And whatever order existed up here had not yet reorganized itself around my presence. Good. The executive floor was quieter than the lobby. But the quiet was wrong. People in institutions communicate through tempo. How quickly doors close. How long eye contact holds. Whether assistants rise from their desks with ease or with alarm. Whether conversation stops naturally or cuts off mid-breath. As I passed the outer offices, I caught a series of small misalignments that, taken alone, meant nothing, and, taken together, meant everything. Un assistant, whose smile arrived, half a second too late. A finance director, walking out of a conference room, with his jaw tight, and a file clutched close to his chest. One of the procurement managers, pretending not to see me, until I said her name. And on the ledge, beside Mark's office, a shopping bag, from a luxury boutique, that had no reasoning to be there. I paused beside it, for 1 second too long. Then I kept walking. Mark's assistant, Elena, stood. The moment she saw me, relief flashed across her face, then worry. "Miss Hayes," she said quietly. "We weren't expecting—" "I know." I softened my voice. "Is he alone?" She hesitated, just long enough to answer without speaking. No, I said. Who? Two investors from Singapore. Deputy Commissioner Reynolds. And Martin Keene from the board. So he hadn't been lying. About the meeting. That almost made it worse. While I was downstairs, discovering that some intern felt comfortable throwing his name around like a shield. Mark was upstairs, selling stability to people whose money and influence depended on the hospital, looking professionally managed. Has he been in there all morning? I asked. Elena's eyes flicked toward the closed door. Mostly. I looked at her, and she understood exactly what I was asking next, without my needing to say it. Elena had worked in executive administration long enough to know that the most dangerous question in any building is not what happened, it is how long. She lowered her voice another notch. There have been more disruptions lately. What kind? She chose her words carefully. Informal visitors, unscheduled requests, pressure around access. Tiffany. Maybe not just Tiffany. I nodded once. Thank you. Elena let out the smallest visible breath. The kind people release when they have finally handed a burden to the person who can actually carry it. That was another bad sign. When competent employees begin to look relieved in your presence, it usually means they've been compensating for someone else's disorder for longer than they should have had to. I walked past her desk and stopped outside the glass wall of the conference room. Mark was at the far end of the table, sleeves rolled, jacket off, one hand resting beside a slide deck on projected capital improvements. If you didn't know him, he looked persuasive, focused, calm. His posture said command. His expression said stewardship. He was mid-sentence, probably building toward one of his practiced lines about patient-centered growth or responsible expansion. For a moment, I simply watched him, not as his wife, not as the person who had spent years making room for his confidence, as an operator. And when I did, the gaps were easier to see. He was speaking too broadly, letting ambition cover detail, using language that sounded decisive but avoided specifics. He was doing what he always did, when he believed nobody in the room knew the machinery well enough to challenge him. Normally, I would have stepped in later and cleaned the edges. That instinct was still there. The old reflex, to protect the institution from the man representing it. I hated that I still had it. Martin Keene, one of the board members, noticed me first. His face changed, almost imperceptibly. Mark followed his line of sight toward the glass, and whatever sentence had been in his mouth stalled out before it landed. He recovered quickly. Of course he did. He smiled and spread one hand toward the door and said something to the room that made them all turn. Then he came out to meet me. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Catherine, he said, dropping his voice into marital warmth. You could have warned me. Would that have helped? He gave a small laugh. Depends what kind of welcome you wanted. There it was, charm as deflection. Familiar enough to be almost boring. He leaned in, to kiss my cheek. I stepped back before he reached me. His expression changed by a degree. What happened? He asked. I looked down deliberately, at the front of his shirt, at his cufflinks, at the careful neatness of a man who had not been surprised in any way that mattered yet. Then I looked back up. How long has she been here? He did not ask who. That told me more than any answer would have. Instead, he bought time. Who? The intern in the lobby. His jaw tightened. Just once. I don't know what this is about. Yes. You do. Catherine. She just used your first name. to shut me down in front of staff. She spoke to Henry Walsh, like he was disposable. Nobody in that lobby looked surprised. I kept my voice even. So I'll ask you once. And then I'll stop asking nicely. How long has she been operating? Inside this building? Like your authority belongs to her? For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw the truth move across Mark's face, uninvited. Not guilt. Calculation. That was the moment. A part of me went cold, in a way I could not reverse. Because a guilty man might still care what he had broken. A calculating man only cares what it will cost him. He said, "You're tired." I almost smiled. That was his first move. Whenever he sensed he was losing control of a conversation, reclassify the woman in front of him as emotional, overextended, mistaken, or poorly informed. "You should go home," he continued. "Get some sleep. We'll talk tonight. Privately." Privately. Meaning, where he could shape the narrative, reduce the scale, isolate the damage. I said, "No. We'll talk now." Behind the glass wall, the meeting waited, in suspended silence, investors pretending not to watch, a board member absolutely watching, the deputy commissioner almost certainly understanding more than Mark hoped. Mark glanced back toward the room, then lowered his voice further. "This is not the place." I held his gaze. "Actually, I think it is." He exhaled through his nose. "You're making assumptions based on a child showing off. A child doesn't get that comfortable in a hospital lobby without adult permission." He opened his mouth. "Shut it. And tried a different strategy." "You've been gone a month?" he said. "A lot has happened. Personnel's been stretched. People get sloppy if somebody behaved inappropriately. We'll handle it. We'll handle it." As if he and I were still on the same side of the sentence. I said, "I want HR, legal, and security footage from the lobby. Pulled immediately." His face hardened at last. "For what?" "For the obvious reason. Let's not overreact." That confirmed exactly what I needed confirmed. He was more afraid of documentation than of scandal. I looked through the glass, into the room behind him, and saw Martin Keene, looking directly at us now. "Good. Then let's do this simply," I said. "You finish your meeting? In the next 30 minutes, I want everything related to that intern's access, supervision, department assignment, and personnel record sent to my office. I also want a full log of guest access on this floor for the last 6 weeks. Catherine, and if there's any delay," I said, "I won't interpret it as confusion. I'll interpret it as obstruction." His eyes changed again. There it was. The first clean flash of fear. Not because I had accused him of cheating. Because I had moved past the affair and into systems. Into records. Into traceable things. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Mark looked at me, in a way that told me he was already deciding which lie he wanted to tell first. And to whom? I had known this man for 10 years. I knew his charm, his appetites, his vanity, his panic, his need to be admired. But standing there, outside that conference room, with the executive floor suddenly too quiet around us, I understood something I should have understood much earlier. The affair was not the center of the problem. The affair was just where the pattern became visible. What mattered was the pattern itself. Access without scrutiny. Confidence without merit. Money moving where attention was weakest. Good employees learning to adapt around disorder. And my husband assuming he would always have enough time to explain himself, after the fact. He was wrong about that now. I stepped back, from the door. Wrap this meeting up, I told him. Then come find me. He stared at me. Where will you be? In my father's office? I said, and then I turned and walked away, already knowing that by the time he got there, I would no longer be looking for reassurance. I would be looking for proof. My father's office still smelled the way I remembered. Not exactly the same. Time had thinned it out, but there was still a trace of old paper. Cedar. Coffee gone cold, in a forgotten cup, and that faint sterile tang that seemed to cling to every executive space. In a hospital, no matter how expensive the furniture was, the room had been updated twice since he died. New monitors, new conferencing equipment, cleaner lines. But the bones were still his. The bookshelves, the heavy desk, facing the windows, the framed architectural rendering of the original South Tower expansion, the photograph of him in shirt sleeves, on a construction site, laughing at something off camera. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment and let the door close behind me. Then I got to work. I called Elena first. Hold all non-essential meetings for the next hour, I said. And I want HR, legal, internal audit, and security in here. Quietly. There was no hesitation in her voice. Yes? Ms. Hayes. Also, pull badge access logs for the executive floor and the CEO suite for the last 6 weeks, and any visitor sign-ins that were waived or manually overridden. A beat. Then, understood. I ended that call and made another to Arthur Vance, our general counsel. He picked up immediately. Welcome home. I need you upstairs now. My tone must have told him the rest, because he didn't waste a second on pleasantries. How bad? Bad enough that I don't want anything disappearing while we're still naming it. I'm on my way. Next, I called internal audit. Then HR. Then security. By the time I set my phone down, the exhaustion from the flight had transformed into something cleaner, sharper, and more usable. I was angry. Yes. Hurt. Absolutely. But underneath both was a steadier instinct that had carried me through every crisis since my father died. If the ground under you shifts, stop arguing with the ground. Find the structure. The first person to arrive was not Arthur. It was David. He knocked once and stepped in without waiting for an answer, already holding a tablet in one hand, up close. He looked the way he always did after difficult clinical work. Precisi. Composed. Slightly more tired. Around the eyes than anyone else would notice. He closed the door behind him and studied my face for half a second. How bad? He asked. I almost laughed. At the symmetry. She used Mark's first name in the lobby, like she was using a house key. I said. David's expression didn't change much, but something sharpened in it. Then this isn't new. No. He nodded once, as if confirming what he had already suspected. That made me look at him more carefully. You knew something was off. I knew the culture was drifting, he said. And I knew some people were being protected. How long? He didn't answer right away, which told me he was choosing accuracy over comfort. Long enough that good staff started adjusting their behavior around it. That landed like a bruise pressed directly. What kind of adjustments? People stopped correcting certaines violations unless they had witnesses. Some department heads started routing concerns sideways instead of up. Security was asked, more than once, to ignore access irregularities tied to the fifth floor. Nobody ever said Mark's name directly. They didn't have to. I leaned one hand against the edge of the desk. The building suddenly felt full of ghosts. Small moments I had missed. Patterns I had explained away. Things that had probably looked harmless from a distance and corrosive from 5 feet away. Why didn't anyone bring it to me? David gave me a quiet look. Some of us tried. Some of us. Not all. I understood. People do not report upward into a system if they believe the rot is protected at the top. They survive. They reroute. They wait. Did you? I asked. His eyes held mine. Twice. I let that sit between us. I'm sorry, I said. That surprised him. For what? For making this a place where trying twice felt like enough. He shook his head slightly. That isn't all on you. Maybe not. But some of it was. A knock at the door interrupted us. Elena came in first, followed by Arthur Vance. Our HR director, Melissa Greer, the head of security, and one of the internal auditors. They took one look at my face and understood they were not there for a routine post-travel briefing. Arthur set a legal pad on the table and uncapped his pen. Tell us what happened. I did. Briefly. No emotion I didn't need. No speculation I couldn't support. An intern in the lobby. Open insubordination. Abuse of frontline staff. Informal invocation of the CEO's name. Staff reaction consistent with an existing pattern. Possible unauthorized access or influence. Potential exposure beyond HR. When I finished, Melissa from HR looked like she wanted to be sick. Her name? She asked. Tiffany. I didn't catch the last name. Melissa frowned. I can get it? Do. The auditor. A lean man named Seth, who had spent years building a reputation for seeing what other people ignored, opened his laptop. If she's on payroll, we'll have a department record. Supervisor. Start date. And access level. The head of security added, badge logs are coming. Arthur looked around the room. From this point forward, assume document preservation. No deletions. No retrospective cleanup. No verbal side agreements. If anything has been mishandled, I need to know before opposing counsel does. The phrase should not have made my stomach drop. But it did. Because there it was. Out loud. Before anyone had even said the words. Affaire. Frau. Or divorce. The machinery of consequence had started moving. And everybody in the room knew it. Melissa's assistant emailed first. Tiffany Henry. Summer administrative intern. Attached. On paper. To donor relations. On paper. The second Seth saw that. He muttered. That doesn't make sense. Why not? I asked. He turned the screen toward me. Her system access is wrong. For donor relations. She shouldn't be cleared. For executive floor proximity. Procurement folders. Or discretionary scheduling windows. Arthur looked up. But she is? Seth nodded. At least some of them. Melissa went pale. Who approved that? Nobody answered immediately. Because everybody already knew the answer. Even before the actual name surfaced. In the metadata, override authorization. Office of the CEO. I felt something inside me go very still. It is a terrible thing to realize that the person you married didn't merely betray you in private. He altered the architecture around you and expected you not to notice. David spoke first. Can you tell how often she used the access? Working on it. Seth said. Another email came in. This one from security. Badge swipes. Entry points. Elevator permissions. Visitor bypasses. There it was. Her name showed up. On the executive floor, far more often than any interns should. Early mornings. Late evenings. Weekends. Twice after midnight. Melissa stared at the log. This can't be real. Arthur didn't look up from his notes. It's real, I asked. Who signed off on the waivers? Security answered. Manual approvals are tagged through the CEO suite. Of course they were. Elena, who had been standing near the credenza, with the controlled posture of someone used to witnessing executive disasters at close range, spoke carefully. There's more. I turned to her. She swallowed. There have been purchases. That word had weight. In a building like ours, what kind of purchases? Personalons. I think, charged through discretionary executive accounts. Or passed through hospitality budgets. She looked embarrassed to be saying it aloud. Flowers. Car service. Restaurant reimbursements. Gift invoices. Arthur's pen stopped moving. How much? I don't know yet. Seth was already typing. I can know in 3 minutes. Do it? I said. Through the glass wall of the office, I could see movement. On the executive floor, beginning to change. Doors opening. Assistants walking faster, the kind of low-grade tremor that spreads through institutions when people sense a private problem might be about to become official. Mark still had not come in. That told me he was buying time, which meant he was either constructing a story or trying to figure out what I had already found. Possibly both. I turned to Arthur. If he starts moving files, he won't get far. Arthur said, Not now. Don't sound so certain. Arthur gave me a hard look. Catherine. With respect. I am not certain of anything, except this. If he has been using company resources to support a personal relationship, that's one problem. If he altered access and financial controls to conceal it, that's a larger one. If any of that touched procurement, donor funds, or capital equipment, it becomes catastrophic. That was the part that could injure the institution itself. Seth looked up from his screen. I found the expense trail. How bad? I asked. He blew out a breath. Bad enough that no one should say, this is just an HR matter. He pivoted the laptop toward the room. A list of charges ran down the screen. Luxury retail. Private dining. Ride services. Hotel incidentals. Floral accounts. Boutique invoice. A jewelry deposit. Coded as event hospitality. And several transfers, routed through a discretionary line item, broad enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. Melissa pressed a hand to her mouth. How did this get through? Seth answered without softness. Because people assume top-level abuse is temporary, until it isn't. Arthur said. Total? Just under 200,000. So far. That got everyone's attention. Mine too. But not in the way I expected. The number wasn't large enough. Torruinos. It was large enough to test the system, which meant this might be the visible edge. Not the full shape. I heard the office door open behind me. Nobody announced him. Mark came in with the controlled expression of a man who had spent 20 minutes deciding which version of himself would be most useful and had settled on injured authority. He looked around the room, took in legal, HR, OD, security, David, and me, behind my father's desk, and smiled like he still thought this might end in negotiation. What exactly is going on? He asked. Arthur answered before I could. Document preservation, he said. And an internal review? Mark's eyes went to Arthur. Then to the laptop screens. Then back to me. Without speaking to me first? I said. You had your chance in the hallway. His jaw tightened. So this is because of a childish scene downstairs? It's because an intern has been using executive access like a second office. His face registered surprise, just a little too late. I don't know what access she has. Seth turned his screen. That's interesting. Because the metadata says, your suite approved it. Mark didn't even glance at the evidence. Then somebody used my credentials. Nobody in the room moved. Not because the lie was good. Because it was insulting. David folded his arms. That's where you're starting? Mark looked at him, with naked irritation. This does not concern clinical leadership. David's voice stayed even. The moment misconduct affects hospital operations, staff behavior, or trust in the institution, it concerns all of us. Mark gave a humorless smile. Of course you'd say that. There was history in that sentence. Not romantic history. Rivalry. Resentment. The particular hatred shallow men develop for competent ones. I stepped in, before the room got dragged sideways. Sit down. Mark? He looked at me. I'd prefer to do this privately. No. Catherine, no. I repeated. You don't get private anymore. That landed. You could see it. In the slight shift of his shoulders. The way his performance recalibrated from marital persuasion to defensive containment. He remained standing. Fine, he said. Then let's be rational. If some intern got carried away and used my name to impress people, that's embarrassing. If she was given broader access than she should have had, that's an administrative failure. It is not grounds for whatever this spectacle is, Arthur said. The expense accounts make it more than embarrassing. Mark finally looked at the laptop, then away. Those could belong to any number of legitimate functions. Seth replied. Boutique jewelry coded as event hospitality is not a legitimate function. Mark didn't miss a beat. Then someone misclassified it. Under your authorization? Or under delegated authority? Every answer arrived, too smoothly. He had done this before. I said, Were you sleeping with her? The room went silent, in a new way. Even Arthur stopped writing. Mark stared at me. You don't ask that in front of staff. You don't turn my father's hospital into a side entrance for your mistress, and then ask me to protect your dignity. Melissa looked down. Elena froze. Seth kept his eyes on the laptop. The way professionals do when pretending not to witness the human center of an institutional implosion. Mark lowered his voice. This is exactly why I wanted privacy. Answer the question. He hesitated. That was enough. Not proof in the legal sense. Proof in the marital one. He saw that I knew it too. And changed tactics immediately. It was a mistake, he said. A brief one. It meant nothing. Nothing. I had once built a life around that man's voice. Now I listened to him describe the thing that had been living inside my marriage and my hospital like a scheduling error. David looked at him with open contempt. Arthur, to his credit, didn't blink. I asked. And the access? The spending? The waivers? Mark spread his hands. I was managing it. There it is, Arthur said quietly. Mostly to himself. Mark snapped toward him. Excuse me? Arthur met his eyes. Not an accident. Then. Management. Mark turned back to me. Catherine. Listen to me. You're exhausted. And everybody in this room is rushing to interpret fragments as a conspiracy because they smell blood. Yes. I exercised discretion. Yes. I covered some things That would have been messy, if over-formalized. That is called executive judgment. Seth actually laughed once. Under his breath. Mark ignored him. I was trying to avoid unnecessary scandal, I said. By creating the conditions for a larger one? He leaned forward. By protecting the institution. That sentence, I did something to me, I will probably never forget. It wasn't just that it was false. It was that he was stealing the language of stewardship to defend the abuse of it. I stood. The room changed the moment I did, not because I raised my voice. I didn't. But because people can feel when a decision finishes forming. You don't get to use that word, I said. Mark's face hardened. I am the CEO. For the moment. His eyes narrowed. What exactly are you threatening? I'm not threatening anything. I looked at Arthur. I want the board chair. Contacted now. I want an emergency executive session. Convened. I want his access frozen. Pending review. Mark gave a short disbelieving laugh. You cannot freeze the CEO. On the basis of gossip and a few ugly receipts. Arthur said. I can advise that it happens. David added. And I can advise the medical board that confidence in executive leadership has materially broken. Melissa, who had been silent too long, finally found her voice. R can recommend immediate suspension, where abuse of authority and hostile environment risk are evident, security said. And from a facility standpoint, I can lock permissions within minutes. On the B1, the room stopped being his. You could see him realize it in real time. Charm does not work well once a system has shifted from impression to record. He knew that. He had just hoped to keep us in impression a little longer. So he did what men like Mark always do when persuasion fails. He turned ugly. This is coordinated, he said, looking from David to Arthur to me. You were waiting for this? Nobody answered. Because in a sense, he was right. Not waiting for this exact scandal. Waiting for the pattern to become undeniable. His gaze landed on David again. You've always wanted her to see me as inadequate. David's expression didn't move. You handled that without help? A dangerous silence followed. Then Mark looked back at me and said the one thing that made the room feel physically colder. If you do this publicly, he said, you don't just take me down. You take the hospital with me. There it was. Not remorse. A threat disguised as strategy. He wanted me to hear the cost and flinch. And for one brief second, I did think of the cost. The headlines. The board panic. Donor calls. Staff morale. Every patient family in the city suddenly looking at our name through scandal. But then I thought of the lobby. Henry being spoken to like trash. Staff learning to survive around corruption. An intern walking through my father's building as if dignity were optional and power were transferable through sex and proximity. He had already taken the hospital with him. He just hadn't been made to stop. I said, no. If I do this, I cut you away from it. Mark stared at me. Arthur was already on his phone. So was Melissa. Security stepped slightly closer to the door. Not aggressively. Just enough to show that the geometry of the room had changed for good. Mark saw it too. His voice dropped. Catherine. Think. I am. You don't want this on the record. I want everything on the record. He took one step toward the desk. Security moved instantly. Not touching him. Not yet. Just blocking the line. The humiliation of that seemed to hit him harder than the suspension itself. He looked around the room one last time. Maybe searching for the old reflexes that had always saved him. The assistant who softened the edges. The lawyer who delayed. The colleague who avoided conflict. The wife who cleaned up behind him. He found none of them. What he found was documentation, witnesses, and a line he had finally crossed. In front of the wrong people. Arthur ended his call. Board chair is convening. Emergency session. Within the hour. Mark went pale. Not dramatically. Just enough that the truth showed through the skin. I looked at him and felt something strange. Not triumph. Not even rage. Mostly clarity. This man had not ruined my life. In one grand betrayal. He had done it. The way institutions get ruined. Through entitlement, concealment, and the repeated assumption that no one with the power to stop him would choose to pay the price of stopping him. He had finally run out of that assumption. Leave your phone, Arthur said. Mark looked at him like he had misheard. Pending review, Arthur repeated. Company devices stay. This is insane. No, I said. This is late. That one hurt him. I could tell. He set the phone down on the conference table with more force than necessary. Then he looked at me. And for the first time all day, the mask fully slipped. What showed underneath wasn't heartbreak. It was resentment. As if I had failed him by refusing to remain useful. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe, I replied. But it won't be the same one twice. He left, without another word. The door shut behind him, and the room stayed still, for a second, absorbing the shape of what had just happened. Then everybody moved at once. Calls, emails, lock orders, preservation notices, audit requests, HR containment language, legal sequencing, security protocols, the machinery of institutional self-defense, roaring to life. After sleeping too long, I put both hands on the desk and bowed my head for exactly one breath. Only one. Then I straightened. Because the truth is, the moment the damage becomes visible enough, everyone has to pick a side, and somewhere underneath the relief of finally seeing the pattern clearly, I knew something else too. Mark was not the kind of man who would go down quietly. Which meant, the worst part, it still wasn't over. I was right about one thing. Mark did not go down quietly. The board suspended him that afternoon, pending formal review. By 6 o'clock, his executive access was frozen. His company devices were in legal custody, and a notice had gone out to senior leadership, saying only that an internal investigation was underway, and interim continuity measures had been activated. Clean language. Controlled language. The kind institutions use when the truth is too large to fit inside one email. For about 3 hours, I thought we might have a chance to contain the damage. Then the internet got there first. I was in my father's office with Arthur and 2 members of communications, reviewing a preliminary risk memo. When Elena's phone buzzed, she glanced down, then looked up at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. Before she said a word, "You need to see this." She turned the screen toward me. The first video clip had already been reposted thousands of times. It was from the lobby, only not the whole scene. Just fragments. Me stepping toward Tiffany. Me saying something, with a face the camera flattened into coldness. David moving between us. Mark coming off the elevator, looking alarmed. No audio from the beginning. None of Tiffany belittling Henry. None of the pattern. None of the context. Just the pieces, most useful, to a lie. A second clip was already circulating, with captions added, in aggressive white text. CEO ambushed at hospital. by controlling wife. Dr. Bodyguard's billionaire heiress. During lobby meltdown. Affair rumors. Inside Apex power struggle. By the time Arthur found the source accounts, there were dozens of them, posting the same material, with slight variations. By the time communications traced the first surge, the story had moved beyond random gossip and into something much more organized. This isn't organic, Arthur said. No, I said. One of the communications directors, Priya, was already typing. The timing is too tight. Same framing. Same clip sequencing. Same push language. Somebody packaged this before it went live. That meant Mark, or someone acting for him, had not merely panicked. He had planned for narrative warfare. Even if he hadn't expected the full confrontation, he had expected enough risk to have a response structure ready. I took the phone back and watched the clip one more time. I looked terrible in it. Not because it was true, because anger, even justified anger, photographs badly when someone else controls the edit. What's the spread? I asked. Priya swallowed. Fast. X. TikTok. Instagram reposts. Reddit threads. Gossip blogs. A few local media producers have already started asking for comment. Arthur said. We're not commenting yet. I kept scrolling. Then I saw David. Not in the main video. In the comments. His name had surfaced. Within minutes. Followed by speculation. Then certainty. Then the usual internet rush to turn incomplete information into a clean moral arrangement. She replaced her husband with the doctor. Look at the way he stands near her. This has been going on. Hospital coup. Classic rich people mess. I set the phone down. For the first time all day, the humiliation reached me, somewhere personal. Not because strangers were wrong, because the wrongness was efficient. It flattened years of work. Grief. Restraint. Compromise. And institutional responsibility into the kind of cheap story people enjoy because it asks nothing of them except immediate judgment. Arthur was watching me carefully. Say it, I said. He didn't soften it. This will not stay private. No. If we wait too long, the lie settles. I know, Priya added. And if we go too early, without framing, it looks defensive. There it was. The trap. Too quiet. And guilt fills the silence. So loud. And you look unstable. Mark knew that. He had lived for years in the space between appearance and accountability. He understood exactly how much damage could be done by forcing me to choose between dignified silence and visible self-defense. Where is he? I asked Arthur. With outside counsel by now? Probably. Or trying to retain one. Can we prove the release came from him? Eventually. Maybe. Quickly? Not likely. I nodded. That was enough to make the next decision simpler. Because if I waited for perfect proof of every piece, I would be ceding the public story to the kind of man who only needed half-truths and speed. I stood. Set a press briefing for tomorrow morning. Arthur looked at me. That's soon. That's why. Priya asked. Formal press conference. Or limited statement? Formal? Her eyes widened. At the hospital? Yes. Arthur leaned back slightly. Studying me. You understand what that means? I do. It meant I would not get to be merely wounded. I would have to be legible, calm enough to reassure, clear enough to hold the line, human enough not to look manufactured, strong enough not to appear cornered. precise enough not to expose the hospital to unnecessary liability. It was a terrible burden. And it was mine. I said. We're not doing a gossip response. We're doing institutional clarification. Patient care is stable. Interim governance is active. An investigation is underway. That part is straightforward. Arthur nodded once. And the rest? The rest depends. On what? I looked toward the window. By then, the city had started slipping into evening. Somewhere below. The hospital was still functioning. Surgeries underway. Shift changes happening. Families receiving good news. And bad news. An unbearable waiting. In equal measure. The real life of the building, continuing, while people online turned it into a stage set. The rest? I said. Depends on whether the truth needs more room than policy language can give it. Arthur understood immediately. You're thinking about David? I didn't answer. Because yes, I was. Not in the way the internet assumed. In the way reality complicates already impossible days. David had spent 15 years being one of the few people in my life who never extracted from me more than I freely gave. He had stood beside me in the lobby because it was the right thing to do. Not because cameras were on. He had spoken plainly, in rooms where plain speech cost people something. He had been carrying quiet witness to my marriage for longer than I had let myself notice. And now his name was being dragged into this because proximity makes an easy lie. I did not know what he would be willing to say publicly. I wasn't sure. I had the right to ask. As if pulled by the thought itself. There was a knock on the door. David came in, without drama, still in scrubs, white coat folded over one arm. He took one look at the room and knew the shape of it. It's out, he said. Yes. How bad? Priya turned the monitor so he could see. He watched 3 clips, in silence. Then he said, He's trying to make you look vindictive. And you look convenient? I said. A corner of his mouth moved without humor. I usually do. Priya, to her credit, gave him the executive summary rather than the gossip version. Coordinated spread, selective editing, rising media interest, likely need for a morning response. David listened, then looked at me. What do you need? The question was simple. That was part of what made him dangerous to my composure. He never rushed in with grand declarations. Never made himself the center of the emotional weather. He just asked the next honest question and stayed in the room long enough for the answer to matter. I need to know. I said, what you're willing to say if they ask about us. Priya, very carefully, looked at her laptop. Arthur kept his face neutral. David didn't answer immediately. Not because he was cornered, because he was treating the truth with respect. Finally, he said, what version of the question? The ugly one. He gave a faint nod. Then the truth? Which is that I've known you since medical school, that we've worked together for years, that I support the investigation, and that there has never been an affair. Something in my chest loosened a little. Then he added, if they push beyond that, I won't lie to make strangers comfortable. Arthur looked up. So did I. David met my eyes, steady as ever. I won't give them your private life, he said. But I won't stand there and pretend I feel nothing about you if the entire strategy depends on me becoming a useful fiction. No one in the room spoke for a second, because there are moments when quiet contains more dignity than speech can improve. Priya was the first to recover. From a communication standpoint, candor is often better than denial. If denial looks rehearsed, Arthur gave her a look that said, this was not, technically, a communications issue. She gave him one back that said, in the real world, it absolutely was. I looked at David. You don't owe me that. I know. Then why do it? He could have answered. A dozen ways. He chose the one that hurt the least. And the most. At the same time. Because you've already spent too many years carrying other people's lies. That almost broke me. Not visibly. Not all the way. But enough that I had to look away for a second and anchor myself on something practical. The grain of the desk, the line of the window frame, the weight of my wedding ring, still on my hand. Though by then, it already felt like evidence. From a closed case, Arthur closed his notebook. Then we have a path. Priya nodded. We frame the hospital first. Then the investigation. Then the false edits. Then any personal question. Only if asked. I said. No personal attacks. No moral performance. No revenge language. Agreed. Arthur said. The room began moving again. Drafting statements. Pulling clip timelines. Coordinating, credentialing. Preparing legal review language. Mapping the first 10 likely media questions. And the 3 worst ones? Identifying which facts could be stated. Which had to be reserved. And which would become obvious the moment anyone with common sense looked at the actual sequence of events, instead of the cut-up version online. Eventually, it was just David and me, left in the office. The building had gone quieter. By then, night shift energy. Different footsteps. Lower voices. Fewer executives. More real work. I took off my ring and set it on the desk. I hadn't planned to do it in front of anyone. I certainly hadn't planned to do it in front of him. But there it was. A circle of metal, catching the light from my father's office lamp. David didn't say anything at first. Then, very softly, "Are you all right?" "No." The honesty surprised both of us. I sank into the chair behind the desk and let my head tip back for 1 second. "I can do the press conference," I said. "I can do the board. I can do legal. Governance. The restructuring. The cleanup. The donor calls. The staff meetings. All of it. But I am suddenly very tired of having to become excellent every time a man makes himself destructive." He stood on the other side of the desk, hands loose at his sides, like someone approaching a frightened animal that happened to be wearing a very expensive suit. "I know," he said. "No, you don't." He let that pass. After a minute, I said, "Did my father know?" Another pause. Then, "More than you think. Less than he wanted." I closed my eyes. Of course. My father had been too observant not to notice Mark's appetites. But observation and proof are not the same thing. And dying men do not always get to finish every protection they meant to put in place. He asked me to keep an eye on things. David said. Not because he thought you were weak. Because he knew you were carrying too much already. I opened my eyes and looked at him. "And you did?" "Yes." "For 15 years?" He smiled. Tired and small. "More or less." I should have said thank you. Instead, I said, "That's a long time to stand that close to a fire." He answered, with the kind of truth only very disciplined men allow themselves once a decade. "Some things are worth standing near." The room went still again. Not romantic. Not yet. Something deeper and quieter than that. Recognition. Maybe. Or the beginning of a permission neither of us was ready to name. I broke eye contact first. Tomorrow is going to be ugly. Yes. And after that? After that? He said. It gets honest. I looked at the ring, on the desk, at the office, that had belonged to my father, at the city outside the glass, at the hospital, still breathing beneath us, and for the first time, since Tiffany had said Mark's name, in the lobby, like she had rights to it. The story rearranged itself inside me. This was no longer just about betrayal. It was about who got to define what had happened inside my marriage, inside my father's institution, inside the life I had spent years holding together with competence and silence. Mark wanted spectacle, because spectacle favors distortion. I wanted record. By the time David left and the office was quiet again, I knew exactly what the morning had to be. Not a defense, a correction. And once I understood that, I was no longer afraid of the press conference. I was only afraid of what would happen if I let him keep speaking for me. By 8:30 the next morning, every seat in the hospital auditorium was filled. Local press, trade reporters, city desks, healthcare bloggers, 2 national outlets that had picked up the story overnight. Camera operators stood shoulder to shoulder at the back of the room, and the front row was already crowded with people who had built careers on sounding morally certain within 30 seconds of hearing incomplete facts. I didn't blame them. That was the market. What mattered was whether I fed it. Priya had wanted a podium. Arthur had wanted a seated table, with counsel visible on camera. I chose a standing microphone. And no backdrop, other than the hospital seal. No slogan wall. No sympathy staging. No family photos. No attempt to make myself look softer than I felt. Just the institution. David stood off to my right. Not too close. Interim leadership. Not emotional prop. Arthur was to my left, with a folder under one arm, and the kind of expression that discouraged careless questions before they were even asked. When I stepped up to the microphone, the room shifted. In that instant, collective way, rooms do, when people decide they are about to witness either a collapse or a correction. I gave them neither opening line they wanted. Good morning, I said. I'm Catherine Hayes. Thank you for coming on short notice. Cameras clicked. Apex University Hospital remains fully operational. Patient care has not been disrupted. Executive continuity measures are in place, and the board has initiated a formal internal review into serious misconduct involving our former WW, Chief Executive Officer. A few heads lifted at former. Good, I continued. Over the past 12 hours, selectively edited videos and false claims about yesterday's events have spread online. Some of those claims are defamatory. Some are deliberately misleading. All of them distract from the actual issue, which is misuse of authority inside a hospital that serves real patients and employs people who deserve better than rumor as management. That got the room quiet. Not because it was dramatic, because it was clear. I will answer questions, I said. But first, I want to establish a factual sequence. I laid it out cleanly. I had returned from an overseas procurement trip on behalf of the hospital. I had entered through the public lobby. I had witnessed inappropriate conduct by a summer intern toward frontline staff. That conduct included verbal abuse, improper invocation of executive authority, and behavior inconsistent with hospital standards. I then requested immediate review of access records, supervision protocols, and financial controls. That review identified concerns, significant enough for board intervention. No adjectives. I couldn't defend. No marital confession. No theatrical indignation. Just sequence. Then I stopped and let the silence do its job. The first question came from a local station. Mrs. Hayes, are you saying the online videos are fake? No, I said. I'm saying they're incomplete in a way that changes meaning. That's different. And it's important. Another hand shot up. Were you having a personal dispute with your husband in the lobby? I was responding to misconduct inside the hospital. That's not what I asked? I know. A few people smiled, despite themselves. Were personal facts also involved? The reporter pressed. Yes, I said, and those facts became relevant only because they intersected with executive misuse of authority. This is not a private marital disagreement that happened to take place at work. It is a workplace integrity issue with personal dimensions. That was the line. Private enough to protect what needed protecting. Public enough not to insult everyone's intelligence. A reporter from an entertainment site leaned forward next. Is Dr. Chen the reason your husband was removed? No. Are you in a relationship with him? Before Arthur could intervene, David stepped toward the second microphone. The room sharpened instantly. He did not touch the stand. He simply looked at the reporter and answered in the same tone he might use to explain a difficult diagnosis to a family he respected enough not to patronize. No, he said. There has been no affair. The reporter tried again. But you were seen physically shielding her yesterday. I was seen intervening in a volatile situation involving staff misconduct and executive instability inside a hospital lobby. A few pens moved quickly. David went on. I have known Catherine Hayes since medical school. I respect her personally and professionally. I support the board's investigation. And I support the staff of this institution who have had to work around behavior they should never have been asked to normalcy. That could have been the end of it. It would have been enough. But one of the national reporters asked the question. Every room had been circling. Dr. Chen, do you have feelings for Mrs. Hayes? Priya stiffened across the aisle. Arthur's jaw set. I felt the entire room lean toward the answer. David, infuriatingly, remained calm. Yes, he said. Not loud. Not hesitant. Just yes. No one moved. For a beat. Then the room erupted. Typing. Whispers. Camera clicks. Somebody in the back, almost dropping a lens cap. David waited until it settled enough to go on. I have for a long time. That is also not the story here. That sentence did more for me than any denial ever could have. Because it refused the cheap structure. It acknowledged complexity without surrendering truth to gossip. He continued, I have never acted on those feelings in violation of her marriage, Mirole, or the ethics of this institution. If you are asking whether yesterday's events were the product of some hidden romantic agenda, the answer is no. They were the result of misconduct, entitlement, and a failure of executive judgment. The room was quiet again. Not satisfied. Exactly. But forced to recalibrate. A city desk reporter raised her hand next. Mrs. Hayes, can you clarify whether hospital funds were misused? Arthur stepped in then. As planned, we are in the early phase of a formal review, he said. What I can confirm is that the board is investigating financial irregularities, access control violations, and abuse of executive authority. We are preserving all records and cooperating with the appropriate legal channels. Is the former CEO facing criminal exposure? We will not speculate beyond the evidence, which, in lawyer language, meant yes enough to be careful. Another question came from the left side of the room. Was the intern involved romantically? With your husband? I answered that one myself. The intern's relationship with former leadership is part of the factual review. Her employment status has been terminated. There was no point in pretending that part wasn't obvious. The same reporter followed up. Will she face charges if evidence shows she knowingly benefited from misconduct or participated in concealment? That will be handled through the proper process. No snare, no public punishment ritual, just consequence. The hardest question came from a woman near the aisle, with the kind of voice that made you think she'd covered enough scandal to know where the real wound usually lived. Mrs. Hayes. With respect. Why did this go on long enough to become a public crisis? That one deserved an honest answer. Because institutions are often slow to confront the people who know how to perform stability while undermining it. I said, because talented employees will work around disorder for longer than they should have to. Because when behavior is tolerated at the top, people start adapting beneath it. And because sometimes the person closest to the problem is also the last one willing to name it for what it is. The room stayed very still. That was the first time, all morning, I felt something close to grief move through my voice. Not enough to crack it. Enough to make it real. I finished the briefing, 22 minutes, after it began. Long enough to establish record. Short enough not to become spectacle. When it was over, I stepped away from the microphone and felt the physical sensation of having crossed a narrow bridge without looking down. David touched my elbow once. Light, brief, steady. No claim in it. Just presence. The first news cycle turned before lunch. Priya, who trusted numbers more than feelings, came into my office at 1:15 with 3 screens open and something like cautious satisfaction on her face. The narrative shifted. She said she was right. The most aggressive clips were still circulating, but now they were running alongside actual sequence, formal statements, and footage from other angles that made the edits look exactly as manipulative as they were. Healthcare reporters were focusing on governance failure. Local outlets were running pieces about access abuse and executive misconduct, even gossip coverage, once deprived of a clean triangle, had started sounding less certain and more annoyed. Mark Sida had overplayed the romance angle. They always do. People can smell when a lie wants too badly to be believed. By late afternoon, donors were calling, not to express alarm, but support. 2 department heads, who had kept their heads down for months, came forward with documentation of prior overrides and pressure from the CEO's office. Security found additional after-hours access logs. Internal audit identified expense routing patterns broad enough to suggest the $200,000 we'd found earlier was not the ceiling. By Friday, it had crossed $500,000. Not enough to destroy Apex. More than enough to make prosecutors interested. The divorce filing happened that same week. Arthur drafted it in language so clean, it almost felt merciful. Irreconcilable breakdown. Breach of fiduciary duty. Asset preservation. Temporary restrictions. Emergency custody protections. Pending review. I signed, without rereading. Not because I was numb, because I was done, confusing endurance with virtue. Mark tried to call twice before his personal line was surrendered through counsel. He sent one email. That was half apology, half strategy memo. As if somewhere inside him, he still believed this was a crisis. We might jointly manage. If he found the right tone. I didn't answer. The children stayed with me. That part, I protected, more fiercely than everything else. They were too young to know details, and old enough to know the house had changed temperature. I told them only what they needed, that their father would not be living with us for a while, that grown-up problems were being handled, and that none of it was their fault. Children hear the truth in the gaps, no matter what you say. So I made sure the gaps held steadiness. Breakfast at the same time, baths at the same time, school drop-off unchanged, their favorite books still on the armchair in the upstairs den, their nanny and teachers briefed, the house quieter. Yes, but not chaotic. The institution had to survive. So did the family. The board made David interim CEO official within a week. No fanfare. No dramatic vote. Just a measured acknowledgement of who had already been acting like leadership before the title caught up when the announcement went out internally. The response told me more than any board memo could have. It wasn't excitement. It was relief. That stung. Relief means people. It have been braced against instability for longer than they admitted. David handled the transition the way he handled everything else. Directly. Without appetite for performance. He met department by department. He asked what had been quietly normalized. He reinstated reporting channels people actually trusted. He separated hospitality budgets from discretionary executive use. He required second signature review on access overrides. He did the unglamorous work of making standards visible again. How reform always looks a little boring from the outside. That's how you know it might last. The legal consequences took longer. They always do. But they arrived. Civil recovery actions on the misused funds, cooperation with investigators, review of procurement-related distortions, examination of shell entities tied to expense laundering, inquiry into whether outside PR payments had been routed through third parties to disguise origin. By then, Mark was no longer frightening, just expensive. Tiffany. Through counsel, I tried to position herself as manipulated, young, misled, peripheral. Some of that may even have been true. But youth does not erase choices, and humiliation does not dissolve participation. She had used proximity to power, as if it were a license, to degrade people who had done nothing to her. The law could sort out percentages of guilt. I no longer needed to. The first time I saw her, after the lobby, was in a deposition conference room. 3 months later. She looked smaller, without the performance around her. Less polished. More brittle. For one brief moment, before the lawyers started, she met my eyes with something that was not defiance. And not remorse. Recognition. Maybe. The realization that she had mistaken access for identity and been ruined by the difference. I felt no pleasure looking at her. Only the cold pity, reserved for people who build themselves around borrowed power and then collapse when it is repossessed. Winter passed. Then spring. The hospital settled. Not magically. Not all at once. Settled the way broken things do, when enough honest hands keep repairing them. Instead of talking about repair, I moved back into my father's office. permanently that February. Not because I needed the symbolism, because I was tired of occupying side positions in structures I was already carrying. The children adapted better than I did. They usually do. By summer, they had stopped asking whether their father, he might come back to dinner, and started asking instead whether David would be there for Saturday pancakes. He never pushed, never presumed. He simply became, over time, part of the shape of our steadier days. Sometimes he came by, after late rounds, and sat at the kitchen island while I finished emails. Sometimes he helped with homework. Sometimes he just stood in the doorway and listened to the children tell him long, chaotic stories that used too many sound effects and no chronology at all. He was good at listening. He had always been good at listening. The difference was that I finally let myself notice what it cost a person to stay that patient for that long. He did not ask me for anything after the press conference. Not emotionally. Not romantically. Not even implicitly. That restraint mattered more than any declaration could have. I had spent too many years around a man who treated attention as entitlement. David's restraint felt almost disorienting at first. Then, slowly, safe. The first evening it changed was unremarkable by every visible standard. Late September. Rain tapping against the kitchen windows. The children asleep upstairs. The house finally quiet after a week that had felt 6 days too long. I was standing barefoot at the counter in one of Mark's old sweaters I had never gotten rid of, staring at 2 untouched mugs of tea and a spreadsheet I had no business still working on. David came in through the mudroom door with the spare key I'd given him for the children months earlier, and stopped when he saw me. "You're still working," he said. "You're still here?" I was dropping off the consent forms from school. I looked at the papers in his hand, then at the tea, then back at him. Neither of us moved for a second. Then I said, "I hate that this house still has his clothes in it." David set the forms down quietly. "Then get rid of them." "It's not that simple." "No," he said. "It usually isn't." I laughed once, tired and surprised by it. And then, because grief is rarely logical, and exhaustion strips pride down to useful size, I started crying. Not elegantly, not in a way that made anyone look noble, just like a woman who had been competent for too many consecutive months and had finally hit the private cost of it. David crossed the room slowly, as if speed might make me retreat, and stopped close enough that I could choose the distance. When I didn't step away, he put one hand lightly at the back of my neck and let me fold toward him. That was all. No speech. No timing claim. No, finally. Just shelter. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough for the rain to soften. Long enough for me to stop shaking. Long enough for something inside me to understand the difference between being handled and being held. When I finally pulled back, he looked at me with the kind of care that makes lying to yourself feel almost insulting. "I don't want to be another demand in your life," he said. "You're not. I can wait." That made me smile through the mess of tears. "You've had a lot of practice." A small smile answered mine. More than I'd recommend. I reached for his hand before I could overthink it. That was the beginning. Not a grand one. A quiet one. The kind built to survive daylight. A year after the lobby incident, we opened the new cardiac wing. Not named for me. Not named for my father. Named for a donor whose gift had made the expansion possible, and whose only condition had been that we stop wasting money on people who mistook the hospital for their personal kingdom. At the ribbon cutting, the cameras came again. But this time, they were there for the right reasons. Patient outcomes, new equipment, expanded beds, hiring, training, capacity, work. Afterward, when the speeches were done and the board members had drifted toward catered coffee and self-congratulation, I slipped away for 5 quiet minutes and ended up in the main lobby, the same lobby, same stone floors, same volunteer desk, same revolving doors, breathing people in and out of the building, different atmosphere. Henry was still there, though now on shorter shifts, by strict order from me and HR. He saw me, smiled, and raised his coffee cup in a tiny salute. I smiled back. Then I looked around the space, where everything had cracked open a year earlier. What I felt was not victory. Victory is too theatrical a word for what comes after survival. What I felt was alignment. The hospital looked like itself again. Not perfect. Alive. Ordered. In the ways that matter. A place where standards were visible. Where people no longer flinched before speaking. Where authority had edges again. I heard footsteps behind me, and I didn't need to turn to know who it was. David stopped beside me. Close enough that our sleeves touched. "You disappeared?" he said. "I was checking on the lobby." And I looked ahead at the doors. At people arriving for appointments they hoped would change their lives. At staff moving quickly because the day was busy. And not because the air was unsafe. And I said, "It's ours again." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It was always yours." I shook my head. No. That was the problem. I kept thinking ownership was enough. He waited. I looked at him then. "At some point," I said, "you have to be willing to occupy what you're responsible for." Something warm moved across his face. Pride. Maybe. Or relief. Then one of my children spotted us from halfway down the corridor and came running at full speed, followed by the other, both of them talking at once about cake and balloons and whether they were allowed to have a second lemonade before dinner. David crouched automatically to catch the younger one before she collided with his knees. I watched the three of them. For a second, the easy laughter, the trust, the complete absence of performance. And I felt something settle in me, so deeply, it was almost silent. This, I thought, not revenge, not vindication, just a life, no longer organized around concealment. I reached for my daughter's hand with one hand, and David's with the other. Then we turned toward the elevators, together. The best thing I built after that day in the lobby was not a case against a dishonest man. It was a life that no longer required me to explain away what hurt. And once I had that, the rest of the noise lost its power.